The cold in the Montgomery house was not the kind that settled in the bones, but the kind that seemed to leach the very warmth from the air itself, a stillness that drank sound and light. Inside, the only illumination came from a single whale oil lamp, its flame burning too low and too blue, casting long, grasping shadows across the rough-hewn timber walls. Eliza Montgomery sat by the hearth, but she did not tend the meager fire. Her hands, chapped and raw, were knotted together in her lap as if in perpetual prayer. Her gaze was fixed on the small figure in the center of the room. Sarah. The child was 3 years old. She stood perfectly motionless, a porcelain doll in a simple woolen dress. She did not fidget. She did not hum. She did not seek out a toy. She simply was. Her eyes, the color of a winter twilight, were open and unblinking, reflecting the feeble lamplight not as points, but as a soft, internal luminescence. From the shadowed corner of the room, Dr. Alistair Finch watched, his leather-bound journal open on his knee. The scratch of his pen was the room's only heartbeat. He had been there a week, a guest invited by his own insatiable curiosity and the terrified whispers of the local townsfolk. "The child that ain't right," they said. "The child the woods fear." Subject exhibits no discernible circadian rhythm, he wrote, the words forming in the chilling air. Sleep, when it occurs, is a state of absolute catalepsy, indistinguishable from waking stillness. No tears. No laughter. No speech. As if sensing the weight of his observation, Sarah's head turned. Not with the jerky motion of a child, but with a slow, seamless pivot, her neck making no sound. Her eyes met his, and Finch felt a familiar, icy trickle down his spine. It was not the gaze of a little girl. It was the regard of a deep, still lake, a surface placidity hiding unmeasured depths. Earlier that day, he had attempted an experiment. He'd taken out his silver pocket watch, its chain gleaming, and swung it before her face. A simple test of attention. The pendulum had arced once, twice, and then on the third swing, it had simply stopped. Not the watch. The very motion. The brass pendulum hung at a 45-degree angle, frozen in the air as if embedded in glass. A sharp, metallic crack had sounded from within the watch's casing. When he snatched it back, the mainspring was coiled into a perfect, impossible knot. Sarah had not moved. She had only offered the faintest ghost of a smile. Now, in the deepening gloom of the evening, a new sound intruded. From outside, a rising cacophony, the frantic cawing of crows. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They were not flying, but gathered in the skeletal branches of the oak tree just beyond the window, a seething, black mass of feathers and noise. Sarah's head swiveled back to face the window. The cawing ceased. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any noise. It was a vacuum. In the lamplight, Finch saw the feathers on the nearest crow puff out, and the bird, as one with its entire murder, went rigid. Not a twitch. Not a shuffle. Just a congregation of black statues, their beaks open in silent screams, their glassy eyes fixed on the little girl in the house. Sarah took a single, soft step towards the window. And outside, in perfect, horrifying unison, every crow bowed its head. Finch's pen froze above the page. The scientific terms, the clinical observations, crumbled to dust in his mind. This was not biology. This was not a medical marvel. This was a covenant, ancient and terrible, and he was not a doctor studying a patient. He was a man, shivering in the presence of a quiet, small, and utterly inexplicable God. The story was not about what was wrong with Sarah Montgomery. The story was about what she was beginning to remember she could do. The memory of that night was not a dream to Eliza Montgomery, though she would later call it that for the sake of her own sanity and the peace of the small, God-fearing community. It was a visitation, stark and real, that began not in her mind but out in the ink-black vault of the Vermont sky. She had been restless, a strange lassitude in her limbs, and had taken to the rocking chair by her bedroom window, the one that looked out over the dark, breathing mass of the woods. The air was perfectly still, the world holding its breath. Then it came, a silent, silver tear in the fabric of the night. It was not like any falling star she had ever heard described in hushed, romantic tones. This was no fleeting spark. It was a deliberate, controlled descent, a lance of cold fire that did not arc but plunged, straight as a plumb line, into the heart of the forest a mere mile from her home. There was no thunderous impact, no tremor in the earth. Instead, the night was flooded for a single, impossible second with a light that had no warmth, a brilliance that did not illuminate but rather seemed to absorb the very essence of the trees and the hills, rendering them flat, negative silhouettes. And in that moment of silent, celestial violence, a profound and unnatural quiet fell upon the world, as if all of creation had been muted. A wave of pressure, dense and humming, passed through the walls of the farmhouse, through the flesh and bone of the woman at the window. It was in that precise instant, she would later confess in a trembling whisper to the one doctor who would eventually listen, that she felt the quickening within her. There was no human agency, no earthly husband, the child was simply there. Conceived not of man, but of an event, a phenomenon, a silent strike from the heavens. The following 9 months were a trial of whispers and sidelong glances, not just from the neighbors but from within her own soul. The child in her womb was preternaturally still, a placid, weighty presence that offered no comforting kicks or turns, only a constant, low-grade hum, a vibration felt not with the hands but with the spirit, a constant reminder that the life she carried was rooted in something beyond the soil of this earth, its origin written in a light that was not of the sun. The infant, when placed in her arms, did not cry. This was the first and most profound break from the natural order, a silence more deafening than any newborn's wail. In a world of raw need and instinct, where life announced itself with a furious, red-faced demand for warmth and sustenance, Sarah Montgomery simply was. Her breathing was a soft, mechanical tide, too even, too measured for a creature of mere hours. The midwife, a woman who had ushered scores of Vermont babies into the harsh light of existence, felt a primitive chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room and made a swift sign of the cross over her own apron before she could stop herself. Eliza, exhausted and bleary, initially mistook this stillness for a divine placidity, a blessing of a contented child. But contentment was a human state, and this was something else entirely. It was an observation. From the very beginning, Sarah's eyes, a blue too pale and clear for a newborn, were open and aware. They did not wander unfocused, but seemed to fix on objects, on the grain of the wooden ceiling beams, on the flickering dance of the candle flame, with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. She never screwed up her face in that universal mask of infant hunger or discomfort. Her needs were signaled not by cries, but by a profound, waiting silence that would eventually prompt her mother to check on her, finding her awake and watching, her diaper soaked or her stomach empty, yet she. The incident with the Miller baby was the moment the strange quality of Sarah's existence shifted from a private unease to a semi-public wonder. Eliza was visiting a neighbor, little Sarah, now a toddler of 2, clinging to her skirts with a quiet, unnerving passivity. The Miller's son, just a few months old, was afflicted with a piercing, colicky wail that had frayed his mother's nerves to breaking point. The sound was a physical presence in the cramped, smoky cabin, a relentless distress signal that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the walls. As Eliza spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones, Sarah detached herself. She did not toddle so much as glide, her small feet making no sound on the rough floorboards, her movement so fluid it seemed to bypass the clumsy mechanics of early walking. She came to a stop beside the crude wooden cradle, which was shaking with the infant's furious convulsions. She did not look at the baby's red, contorted face. Instead, she laid a single, pale hand flat upon the side of the cradle. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The wailing ceased, not trailing off in a whimper, but severed as if by a blade. In the ringing silence that followed, a new sound emerged, a low, resonant hum, a single, sustained musical note that seemed to emanate not from the child, but from the wood of the cradle itself. The pine grain appeared to shimmer, the solid planks thrumming gently beneath Sarah's touch. The baby, moments before a creature of pure anguish, lay perfectly still, his eyes wide and clear, gazing up at the ceiling with a placid, almost thoughtful expression. Young Mrs. Miller stared, her hand flying to her mouth, her own tears forgotten. She would later swear on a stack of Bibles that she saw the very tears on her son's cheeks seem to shrink, not dripping away but receding back into his skin as if they had never been. Sarah removed her hand, and the faint hum faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more charged than the noise it had replaced. She turned and walked back to her mother, her face a placid mask, offering no explanation, no recognition of the small miracle she had just performed, leaving in her wake not comfort, but a deep, superstitious dread. The Montgomery farm, once a place of familiar, bustling life, had become a theater of the uncanny, and its livestock were the unwilling players. It began subtly, with the chickens. They no longer scattered, squawking, when Sarah wandered into the yard. Instead, they would fall still, their heads cocked in unison, their beady eyes tracking her slow progress as if she were their singular, feathered son. The family's old hound, a grizzled and temperamental coonhound named Jasper, who had little patience for anyone but Mr. Montgomery, underwent a transformation that was both profound and chilling. The dog, who once would bark at a falling leaf, now would trail Sarah in absolute silence, padding behind her with a stiff, formal gait, his tail held unnaturally still. He would lie at her feet not to sleep, but to watch, his head on his paws, his eyes fixed on her with an unnerving intensity that was neither canine affection nor canine suspicion, but something closer to reverence or duty. The most disturbing display, however, involved the family's single dairy cow, Bessie. One afternoon, Eliza watched from the kitchen window as Sarah stood at the edge of the pasture, her small hands resting on the split-rail fence. Bessie, a creature of immense and placid habit, was grazing some 50 yards away. Sarah did not call out, did not move. She simply stood and watched. After a moment, the cow's head came up, a wad of half-chewed clover falling from her mouth. She turned, as if hearing a silent summons, and began to walk, not with her usual lumbering gait, but in a slow, deliberate, almost processional stride, directly towards the little girl. She came to a halt a few feet from the fence, and then, with a slow, creaking bend of her front legs, the enormous animal knelt. It was not a stumble or a collapse, but a clear, deliberate act of genuflection, her great head bowed low. In that moment, the entire farmyard was frozen in a tableau of silent obedience. Not a chicken clucked. Not a fly buzzed. Jasper, lying beside Sarah, did not so much as twitch an ear. The only sound was the soft, almost inaudible hum that seemed to emanate from the air around Sarah herself, a vibration that tuned the entire world to her strange and silent frequency, commanding a loyalty that bypassed instinct and spoke of a far more ancient and terrifying chain of command. The rumors, carried on the hushed, anxious breaths of farmers and their wives, were a seed that found fertile ground in the mind of Dr. Alistair Finch of Boston. He was a man carved from rationality and ambition, a disciple of the new sciences who believed the world was a complex lock awaiting the right key, and he intended to be the one to forge it. The whispers of a child in the Vermont wilds who did not cry, who commanded animals, who was born of a strange light, were to him not tales of witchcraft, but symptoms. They were a fascinating pathology, a potential crack in the understood facade of human development. He arrived at the Montgomery homestead unannounced, his carriage a black splinter against the verdant landscape, his presence an intrusion of the modern world into a place that was beginning to feel increasingly ancient. He presented himself not as an exorcist or inquisitor, but as a man of learning, offering the bewildered and isolated family the solace of a scientific explanation. His demeanor was a masterful blend of authority and condescending benevolence. He spoke of rare neurological conditions and hysterical contagion within the community, terms that sounded like answers to the terrified Montgomerys. He set up his temporary practice in their parlor, a bastion of polished wood and gleaming brass instruments juxtaposed against the rough-hewn log walls. His examination of Sarah was meticulous, cold, and thorough. He documented her vitals, which were, to his profound frustration, perfect. He noted the unsettling calm of her respiration, the steady, metronomic rhythm of a pulse that never quickened, not even with the prick of a needle. He observed the way her eyes, the color of a winter twilight, followed his movements not with a child's curiosity, but with the detached, analytical focus of a fellow scientist, a peer reviewing a flawed experiment. He filled his leather-bound journal with precise, clinical language, yet each entry felt more like a desperate attempt to cage a phantom with a net of words. The child was a locked box, and he could find no keyhole, no seam, no hint of the mechanism inside, only the maddening, silent perfection of the exterior. The pocket watch was Dr. Finch's pride, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering whose inner workings were a tiny, gleaming city of ordered cogs and spinning wheels, a testament to man's dominion over the natural chaos of time. He used it not just to mark the hours, but as a tool of his trade, a pendulum to test reflexes, to gauge the flicker of attention in a subject's eyes. With Sarah seated before him in her unnerving placidity, he decided to employ it once more, hoping to find some crack in her preternatural calm. He unclipped the heavy silver timepiece, letting it dangle from its chain, and began to swing it in a smooth, metronomic arc before her face. Back and forth it went, a sliver of captured light. Sarah's pale eyes followed it, but not with the drowsy, tracking gaze he expected. Her focus was sharp, intent, as if she were not being tested by the rhythm, but was herself deconstructing its very principle. On the third pass, as the watch reached the apex of its swing, preparing to fall back into its graceful descent, it stopped. It did not slow. It did not waver. It simply ceased its motion, freezing dead in the air as if it had been instantly and perfectly embedded in a block of clear glass. The chain was still slack in Finch's fingers, offering no tension, no physical reason for the violation of momentum he was witnessing. In the profound silence of the arrested moment, a sound erupted from within the watch's case, not a tick, but a sharp, discordant crack, the sound of something fundamental snapping under a stress it was never designed to bear. A fine web of fractures appeared on the inside of the crystal face. Finch snatched his hand back, the watch falling limp against his palm, now just a dead weight. When, with trembling fingers, he pripped open the case, he found the mainspring, the very soul of the mechanism, coiled into a tight, impossible knot, a snarl of ruined brass. Sarah, who had not moved a muscle, offered the faintest ghost of a smile, a fleeting curl of her lips that held no child's amusement, but the cold satisfaction of a principle demonstrated, a law rewritten. The change began at the tree line, a subtle retreat that at first seemed like a trick of the light or a shift in the wind. The birds were the first to go, the familiar chorus of sparrows and finches that greeted the dawn from the woods behind the Montgomery farm simply fell silent one morning, replaced by a void of sound that was more deafening than any noise. Then the squirrels vanished from the oaks, the rabbits from the brambles at the edge of the pasture. It was not a migration but an evacuation, a silent, swift exodus that left the forest bordering the property eerily empty. Within a day, the absence had solidified into a visible boundary. A perfect, quarter-mile radius of silence now encircled the homestead, a bubble of unnatural stillness where no leaf seemed to rustle without Sarah's direct presence. It was on the second day that the forest itself began to protest. Eliza Montgomery was the first to see it, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream as she looked out at the maples and birches that marked the edge of their land. From the veins of every leaf, from the needles of every pine, a thick, dark sap was weeping forth. It oozed slowly, relentlessly, tracing glistening, black paths down the bark, dripping from the branches to pool on the forest floor like spilt blood. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, grew heavy with the cloying, metallic smell of it, a scent like a rusted nail. This was no ordinary blight. The trees were not sickly or wilting. They stood strong and vital, their very life force seeming to be forced out of them under a terrible, invisible pressure, a silent, vegetative scream against the presence that had claimed their domain. The bleeding continued for 3 days and 3 nights, a slow, gruesome testament to a violation of the natural order so profound that the land itself was hemorrhaging, creating a moat of horror around the child who sat silently within the house, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. While the world outside wept black tears, the silence in the house had become a physical presence, a woolen blanket smothering sound and hope in equal measure. Eliza Montgomery moved through the rooms like a ghost in her own home, the creeping dread of the past weeks having eroded the last vestiges of a mother's love, leaving only a raw, primal terror in its wake. The child, Sarah, sat in her usual spot on the floor, her back to her mother, a small, still statue in a world she had drained of all its noise and color. It was the sight of that calm, untroubled back that finally broke Eliza. A surge of hysterical fury, born of sleepless nights and the memory of bleeding trees, propelled her forward. She grabbed Sarah by the shoulder, her grip tighter than she intended, and dragged the unresisting child across the room to the heavy, gilt-framed mirror that had been her grandmother's. "Look," she hissed, her voice a ragged tear in the silence. "Look at yourself. What are you?" She forced Sarah to face the glass, her own wild, tear-streaked reflection a stark contrast to the placid face of the girl beside her. For a single, heart-stopping second, everything was normal. Then Eliza's eyes, locked on the reflection, saw it. The Sarah in the mirror was not mimicking the real child. Her head was tilted at a slightly different angle. And her eyes, they were closed. As Eliza watched, frozen in a paralysis of pure horror, the reflected Sarah's lips, full and pale in the silvered glass, began to curve. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a smile of such ancient, knowing cruelty that it held no trace of the little girl it mimicked. It was the smile of a predator contemplating its prey, a cold, intellectual amusement at the fragility of the woman screaming soundlessly before it. The real Sarah, whose shoulder Eliza still clutched, remained motionless, her own face a blank page, offering no echo of the monstrous expression her duplicate wore in the captive world behind the glass. The fracture was now complete. The vessel was not merely empty, but contained a reflection of something that dared not show its true face in the light of the living world. The physical form of Sarah Montgomery, once the solid, warm vessel of a child, began to betray its true nature. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual attenuation, a subtle leaching of substance that Dr. Finch documented with a hand that grew increasingly unsteady. He first noticed it in the slant of the afternoon sun, as its golden light fell upon her where she sat today. Instead of casting a sharp, definitive shadow, the light seemed to pass through her, softening her edges and lending her a faint, shimmering quality, like a heat haze rising from summer stone. He could, for a disorienting moment, see the faint pattern of the wall's timber through the fabric of her dress and the pale shape of her shoulder beneath. It was as if her density was fluctuating, as if the very atoms that composed her were forgetting, for brief intervals, their obligation to form a solid thing. This visual phenomenon was accompanied by an even more disturbing auditory one. Sounds began to behave strangely in her proximity. The sharp cry of a jay outside the window, when it reached the space she occupied, would suddenly dampen, not as if being muffled, but as if the sound wave itself was being partially absorbed, passing through her and emerging on the other side thinner, hollowed out, stripped of its urgency and timbre. A door slammed elsewhere in the house would produce not a single, sharp report, but a fractured echo, a stutter of noise that seemed to ripple through her form without her so much as flinching. She was becoming less a child and more a lens, a focal point where the physical properties of the world, light, sound, matter, were subtly distorted, warping around the edges of the profound and terrible emptiness that was slowly announcing itself within the shell she had once so convincingly inhabited. The hum that often surrounded her now seemed less an emanation and more the sound of the universe straining to fill the void where a human soul should have been. Dr. Alistair Finch closed his journal, the soft click of the leather cover sounding like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the Montgomery parlor. The pages within were a testament to his failure, a chronicle of observations that led not to a diagnosis, but to an abyss. He was no longer studying a child, he was cataloguing the properties of a phenomenon. The shattered watch, the bleeding trees, the hollowing of her form, these were not symptoms of a disease, but the side effects of a presence that operated on principles alien to his world. The choice before him now was stark and terrible, a precipice upon which his entire worldview teetered. One path was that of the destroyer, an act of preemptive salvation for a humanity that slept soundly in its ignorance. He had the means, a scalpel, a dose of concentrated laudanum, the heavy fireplace poker. To extinguish this quiet, growing threat before it could fully bloom, to treat this not as a life but as a cancer, would be the ultimate, terrible application of his scientific rationale. It would be a clean, surgical strike against the inexplicable. The other path was one of terrifying communication. To lay down his instruments and approach her not as a physician to a patient, but as a man to a power. To try and understand, to ask the question that now screamed in his mind. This was the path of the pure scientist, the seeker of truth, but it was fraught with a peril he could not calculate. To open a dialogue might be to invite the thing in, to grant it a greater purchase on his reality. It was a risk that could unravel the very fabric of the world he knew, a gamble with stakes that were cosmically, horrifyingly high. He looked at the small, translucent figure by the window, a vessel of immense and silent potential, and knew that his next action would not be one of science, but of faith, either faith in the necessity of destruction, or a catastrophic faith in the possibility of comprehension.